A grandmother once could carry a whole family through 4 seasons with 3 ingredients and a few spare cents. In a small kitchen in the American South, around the 1930s, a weak yellow light fell across an old wooden table. On it were cornmeal, a bowl of water, and a little salt. The cast-iron skillet still held a thin wisp of smoke from the meal before, steam clouded the window panes, and the sound of a wooden spoon scraping the bottom of the pot rang out slowly. She didn't need a neatly printed recipe. Her hands already remembered the color of the meal, the way the water should boil, and the exact moment the porridge was thick enough to set on the table. These dishes were once called poor food, country food, food that didn't matter much. But really, they were the intelligence of a generation that knew how to use everything down to the very last bit. Dish number 26 once kept an entire household full for less than 8 cents in 1935. Dish number 12 borrowed the taste of lemon from vinegar, and dish number 1 felt more like an end-of-the-day memory than a recipe. Tonight, the old recipe box is being opened one more time. Pull a chair close to the stove and listen all the way through to see which dish reminds you of the person who used to cook for you. 30 dishes, starting with dish number 30. Before the sun even reached the porch roof, many poor kitchens had already awakened to the sound of a wooden spoon touching the bottom of a pot. That sound was slow, dry, and steady, like the breathing of a house still cold after a long night. Breakfast had to be hot, thick, and strong enough to stay in the stomach until noon. Number 30. Cornmeal mush. The slow scrape of a wooden spoon along the bottom of a cast-iron pot opened the morning. The mush thickened little by little, steam rising with the smell of hot corn and a trace of old stove smoke. In the 1930s, in the rural South in the valleys of Appalachia, she could buy a pound of cornmeal for about 3 cents, then stretch it across several meals for the whole family. She heated the water until the surface of the pot gave a light tremble, sprinkled the cornmeal in as if scattering gold dust, stirred hard so the mush would not clump, then lowered the fire and let the heat hold the pot for a long time. Her wrist moved in a steady circle. The spoon grew heavier. A thick, smooth streak appeared along the side of the pot, enough for her to know breakfast was ready to be ladled out. In homes with little cash, cornmeal sat quietly in the cupboard like a small promise. It became breakfast, became supper, and became the cooled portion saved for tomorrow. On the window glass, steam blurred the blue light before dawn. Cornmeal held the stomach until noon. Number 29. Fried cornmeal mush. A mold of cooled mush sat on the table from the night before. The next morning, the knife cut down with a firm sound, as if last night's supper had just found another life in the skillet. In 1932, in many Southern kitchens during the Great Depression, a pound of cornmeal costing around 3 cents could become hot mush, then fried slices for the next morning's breakfast. She poured the leftover mush into a mold, let it cool overnight, cut it into thick pieces, then laid each slice into a cast-iron skillet with hot bacon grease. The sizzle rose short and sharp. The edges turned golden, the outside grew crisp, and the center stayed soft. When syrup or molasses ran into the small cracks, a warm sweetness spread across the wooden table. Children might remember very little about the price of things, but they remember the sound of her turning each slice before school. They remembered the warm plate, fingertips sticky with molasses, and the kitchen seeming brighter for a few minutes. An old meal still fed a new morning. Number 28. Milk, gravy, and biscuits. On a cold morning, the window glass was fogged with steam. On the stove, white gravy slowly flowed over split biscuits, soft and rich like a small blanket. Around 1940, in poor Southern kitchens, when a quart of milk often cost about 13 to 15 cents, she saved the skillet grease to turn biscuits into a breakfast heavy enough to last. She scraped up the grease left clinging to the bottom of the pan, sprinkled in flour, stirred until the raw flour smell softened, then poured in hot milk a little at a time. The gravy began to pull together around the spoon. She kept stirring, slower now, firmer, until that white layer was smooth enough to cover the biscuits she had just split open. The people heading out to the fields or into the mill needed a breakfast that would stick to them. Work coats hung over the backs of chairs, boots sat by the door, and on the table was a plate of biscuits covered in gravy, hot enough that they had to blow on it gently before eating. White gravy kept a person standing. Number 27. tomato gravy. The smell of hot tomatoes meeting bacon grease rose dark red through the kitchen. It was a little sour, a little smoky, enough to give life to a plain piece of cornbread. In 1943, in New York, a number 2 can of tomatoes cost around 13 cents. And in many Southern families, one cheap can with a little bacon grease was enough to make a skillet of gravy for the whole table. She browned flour in the grease left behind, stirred until the flour turned a pale shade, poured the tomatoes into the skillet, then stirred slowly as the heat thickened the gravy. A small bubbling sound rose beneath the stove lid. She spooned that red gravy over biscuits, cornbread, or slices of fried cornmeal mush, still crisp at the edges. There were mornings when the cupboard was almost empty, but the skillet was still hot, and there were still people sitting at the table, waiting. In the recipe box, dishes like this usually did not need many words, because her hands already remembered the path of every motion. Red gravy saved a poor breakfast. Number 26. Salt, pork, and beans. The smell of pinto beans simmered for hours clung to the curtains, thick and warm. At the bottom of the pot, the small piece of salt pork slowly melted down, as if it were still doing one more bit of work. In 1935, in Kentucky mining towns, Mississippi tenant homes, and immigrant kitchens in Chicago, a pot of salt pork and beans could cost less than 8 cents if the meat was cut very small. She rinsed the beans in an enamel basin, dropped the piece of salt pork into the bottom of the pot, poured in enough water to cover everything, and then simmered it over low heat from morning until evening. The pot lid trembled very softly. The salty smell slowly seeped into the steam. By night, the beans were soft under the spoon, the broth had thickened, and the whole kitchen seemed to move more slowly. One small piece of meat was not enough to place separately on each plate. In a pot of beans, it went farther, more quietly, more fairly. Work clothes hanging behind the door still carried coal dust. One piece of meat fed the whole pot. Number 25. Bean soup with smoked ham hock. A smoked ham hock sat in the middle of the pot like the last key to supper. Around it, the beans softened in cloudy water. By the middle of the 20th century, in many working-class kitchens in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois, a ham hock costing about $1 and a pound of dried beans costing about 40 cents could become a pot of soup large enough for many people. She soaked the beans overnight, placed the ham hock in a deep pot, filled it with water, and then simmered it until the smoke, salt, and fat slowly pulled into the broth. Foam rose to the top, and she skimmed it away with an old spoon. When the beans began to split softly, the soup turned thick, fragrant, and the color of a long day beside the stove. In the kitchens of immigrants, miners, or war widows, that pot became supper, lunch the next day, and then a small bowl carried over to the house next door. They shared it by the ladle. Old smoke gave beans a soul. Number 24. Dried bean soup. A bone left over from Sunday dinner rested in a quiet pot of water. Most of the meat was already gone, but she knew the flavor was still tucked close to the bone. In 1940, in many families living through the Great Depression and the Second World War in Appalachia and the Midwest, a bowl of dried bean soup could cost only about 14 cents. She soaked the beans, dropped the ham bone into the pot, simmered it for 3 hours, then stirred slowly so the beans would break down and make the soup thick and cloudy. The sound of the spoon touching the side of the pot was low and deep. The smell of smoke blended with the steam, clinging to the old kitchen towel and the yellow light over the table. In a poor kitchen, a bone still had flavor, water still had room to become soup, and beans still had enough strength to fill the whole family. In the recipe box, dishes like these were often remembered by smell before they were remembered by words. An old bone still held the taste of life. The pots of beans helped the whole family stay on its feet. But in her kitchen, even bread that had gone hard was never treated as if its life was over. Some dishes entered the kitchen gently. After pots of beans had simmered for hours, old bread stepped into another life in hot milk, melted butter, and hands that knew how to soften days of not having enough. Number 23. Bread and milk. The smell of hot milk rose from the white enamel bowl. The old bread slowly softened, while the small piece of butter melted into a quiet yellow streak on the surface. In 1931, from Tennessee to Oregon, when a loaf of bread cost about 8 cents and a gallon of milk was around 26 cents, She knew how to make a soft meal for the days before payday came. She tore the old bread into a bowl, warmed the milk until the heat covered her hand, poured it slowly over each piece of bread, then placed the small piece of butter in the middle. The butter melted, pulling a thin yellow line across the top. The sound of the spoon touching the side of the bowl was very light, as if the kitchen were speaking softly. This dish often came to the sick, the old, the young, or anyone worn out after a long day. It was poor, but it still carried the warmth of being cared for. Old bread softened in her hands. Number 22. Bread pudding. On a Sunday afternoon, the poorhouse suddenly smelled of something baking. Old bread rose in milk and eggs, fragrant like a small gift. In 1933, in many Great Depression families in Ohio and Pennsylvania, a few slices of old bread costing only a few cents, with milk and eggs added, were enough to make something sweet to set in the middle of the table. She tore the bread into a pan, beat the eggs with milk, poured the mixture over the top, then baked it until the surface turned golden. The edges were a little crisp. Inside, it was soft, moist, and smelled of custard. If there was a little cinnamon that day, the kitchen seemed brighter under the evening light. Children remembered the golden top before they remembered the days without money. To them, Sunday had a very small sweetness, but it stayed for a long time. Old bread still knew how to become a gift. Number 21. Biscuits and milk. Night came down, and the stove had gone cold. In a small bowl, a few biscuits were crumbled by hand, and cold milk was poured over them with a sound as soft as rain. In 1940, in the rural parts of Kentucky and Arkansas, when milk bought by the quart often cost only a few cents, biscuits left over from supper could become the last dish of the day. She crumbled the biscuits into a bowl, sprinkled in a little salt, poured milk over the top, then let the biscuits soak up just enough. The old spoon was passed across the table. The biscuits softened very quickly. The small salty taste gave the milk depth, while the kitchen sank into a gentle quiet before bedtime. This was food for nights when the firewood had burned down, the people in the house were tired, and the stomach needed to settle. In the recipe box, it rested there like a word of comfort. A poor late-night meal still needed tenderness. Number 20. Syrup sandwich. A slice of white bread lay on wax paper. She spread the butter very thin, then drizzled amber-colored syrup into a sticky, sweet line. In 1936, in the rural south of Georgia and Alabama, when jam was often too expensive for the end-of-the-month pocket, cane syrup, costing a few cents, could stand in as the sweet taste for a school lunch. She spread the butter, drizzled the syrup, folded the bread, then wrapped it in wax paper. That little sandwich followed the children out the door, soft, fragrant, and a little sticky on their fingertips. The rustle of the paper in a coat pocket sounded like a reminder that someone at home was still thinking of them. To a child, it was a sweet sandwich. To her, it was a little strength wrapped up before a long school day. A small sweetness went with the child. Old bread could soften again in milk, but other dishes needed a stronger fire, hotter grease, and the cast-iron skillet that had turned black after years of feeding the whole family. In her kitchen, the cast-iron skillet rarely went completely cold. It held on to the smell of smoke, the thin layer of grease, the sizzle that had just died down, and even the small bits that still had enough left in them to feed one more meal. Number 19. Crackling cornbread. Cracklings fell into the cornmeal with a small, dry sound. When the batter touched the hot skillet, a thin sizzle rose like the promise of supper. In 1938, in rural families in Georgia and Alabama, a pound of cornmeal cost about 3 to 4 cents, and the cracklings left after rendering pork fat were saved for cornbread. She mixed cornmeal with water or buttermilk, broke the cracklings into the middle of the yellow batter, poured the mixture into the hot cast-iron skillet, then let the bottom of the bread take hold of the heat. The top slowly dried, the edges crisped. The smell of pork fat, stove smoke, and toasted corn came together, making the poor kitchen feel fuller. Cracklings carried salt, smoke, and a little precious fat. Because of them, an ordinary pan of cornbread felt as if it had once touched meat. Cracklings held the sound of the old skillet. Number 18. Fried salt pork with white gravy. The smell of salt pork, browned at the edges, rose from the skillet. Just a few thin slices, but the grease left behind began to tell the rest of the story. In 1946, in southern tenant farms and Ohio railroad workers' kitchens, a few slices of salt pork costing about 10 to 15 cents could be stretched with flour and milk. She sliced the salt pork very thin, dredged each piece through flour, fried it until the edges curled, then kept the glossy grease at the bottom of the skillet. She sprinkled in more flour, stirred hard, and poured in milk or water a little at a time. The white gravy thickened, covering biscuits or cornmeal mush like a hot coat. Working people needed salt, a little fat, and enough gravy for everyone at the table to taste the trace of meat. The grease left behind kept working. Number 17. Potatoes, onions, and grease. On a Friday night before payday, the kitchen still had a sack of potatoes and a string of onions. She opened the jar of bacon grease as if she were opening the last part of the week. In 1941, in working families in Pennsylvania and Iowa, potatoes cost a few cents a pound. Onions were cheap too, and bacon grease was already waiting in the jar beside the stove. She sliced the potatoes thin, cut the onions into small rings, dropped a spoonful of grease into the skillet, then covered it so the heat could do its work. The potatoes softened first, then the bottoms turned golden. The onions grew sweet, clinging lightly to the edges of the potatoes, giving off a warm and familiar smell. This was the dish for evenings when everyone in the house looked at the potato basket and understood the meal. Simple, hot, enough to make the room feel less empty. Hot potatoes made the evening feel less lacking. Number 16. Rice and gravy. A bowl of white rice waited on the table. In the skillet, the brown grease was stirred into the gravy, glossy and deep like the memory of meat that was already gone. In 1952, in Cajun kitchens in Louisiana, rice was cheap, and the gravy from the skillet helped the flavor of meat go much farther than the original piece of meat ever could. She cooked white rice, scraped up the brown grease stuck to the bottom of the skillet, sprinkled in flour, then stirred it with water until the gravy thickened. The sound of the spoon scraping the bottom of the skillet was rough and low. When the gravy poured over the rice, each white grain took on the warm brown color. In the recipe box, dishes like this often reminded people that the old kitchen knew how to keep every trace that could still be used. Brown gravy remembered the old piece of meat. Pork fat and cast iron held on to the flavor of what had already passed. But in many even poorer kitchens, even wild greens from the yard and the water left from boiling vegetables once had a place on the table. There were things in later kitchens that could easily run down the sink. But in her kitchen, vegetable water still had flavor, grease still had strength, and leaves growing out in the yard were still worthy of stepping onto the table. Number 15. Dandelion greens tossed with hot bacon grease. In early spring, the ground was still cold under her heels. She took a knife out into the yard, bent down, and picked young dandelion leaves still wet with dew. In 1934, in Pennsylvania and Ohio, dandelion greens from the yard were almost free, and a few slices of bacon costing 12 cents were enough to make the grease for dressing a whole bowl of greens. She picked the tender leaves close to the ground, washed the dirt and grit away in a basin of cold water, heated bacon grease in a small skillet, then poured the grease with a little apple cider vinegar over the greens. A very soft sizzle rose. The green leaves wilted down, and the sour, rich, slightly bitter smell lifted like the first breath of a new season. Early spring often made the kitchen fall quiet, because the storage cellar had been emptied after the long winter. A handful of greens from the yard brought color back, beside the potatoes, beans, and flour that had carried them through months of cold. Wild greens knew how to feed people too. Number 14. Pot liquor and cornbread. A bowl of dark pot liquor sat on the table. She broke cornbread into it slowly, as if she were finishing the very last part of supper. In 1931, in Alabama and Georgia, the pot liquor from a pot of greens cost almost nothing extra, and a piece of cornbread costing a few cents could turn it into a hot meal. She ladled the pot liquor into a deep bowl, crumbled dry cornbread over the top, pressed it down gently with the back of a spoon, then let the crumbs soften in the salty, smoky, dark green flavor. The surface of the liquid trembled. The bread soaked up the pot liquor, swelled, softened, and carried with it the smell of pork fat that had cooked for a long time. In a kitchen where things were scarce, pot liquor held on to the salt, the grease, and the taste of the greens. They ate slowly, because every spoonful carried the warmth of a pot of greens just taken from the stove. Pot liquor was once supper. Number 13. Greens and fat. The smell of greens cooked for a long time with pork fat settled deep into the kitchen. It was dark green, salty, warm, and carried a little smoke that stayed at the back of the throat. In 1942, in poor southern kitchens, a bunch of collard greens costing a few cents and a small piece of pork fat could become a pot of greens big enough to set in the middle of the table. She washed each leaf, tore it away from the tough stem, dropped it into the pot with pork fat and water, then cooked it slowly until the leaves softened. The water turned dark. The heat clouded the window glass. When she lifted the lid, the smell of greens, fat, and stove smoke spread out slowly, deeply, almost solemnly. This dish needs to be spoken of gently. It carried part of the inheritance of kitchens that knew how to cherish what others looked down on, where green leaves and a little fat could still feed the whole household. What had been forgotten still fed the home. Wild greens and pot liquor carried people through days when supplies ran low. But even in hardship, she still knew how to hold back a little sweetness for Sunday. There were Sundays in poor homes with no pretty cakes, no fresh fruit, and no rich cream. But she still found a way to set a small sweetness on the table, enough to make the room feel softer and brighter after many days of beans, greens, and grease. Number 12. Vinegar pie. The smell of apple cider vinegar rose first, sharp and light. Then sugar, eggs, and heat softened it, as if the kitchen had borrowed the taste of lemon. In 1937, in southern and midwestern families, when lemons out of season cost more than the weekend pocket could manage, a vinegar pie costing around 8 cents could still appear on the Sunday table. She beat eggs with sugar in a ceramic bowl, added apple cider vinegar by the spoonful, poured the pale yellow filling into the pie crust, then baked it until the top set. The edge of the crust turned brown, the center trembled softly under the knife, smooth like custard, with a bright sourness strong enough to wake up the whole poor meal. When the house had no fruit, vinegar helped the pie feel fresher. Children heard the knife touch the plate and knew Sunday still had a sweet piece saved for them. Poor vinegar borrowed the old taste of lemon. Number 11. Water pie. A pie that almost began with water. The kitchen was quiet. The oven slowly heated, and she placed it inside as if she were putting dignity on the table. In 1932, in Oklahoma and Kansas during the Great Depression, flour, sugar, and the last bit of butter could make a water pie for around 6 cents. She poured water into the pie crust, sprinkled flour and sugar over the top, added a small piece of butter if the butter jar still had enough, then baked it slowly until the filling set. In the oven, the top turned just lightly golden. When she took it out, the center was clear, soft, and trembled with each movement of her hand. This dish needs to be told in a slow voice. It belonged to kitchens that wanted to keep one decent thing on the Sunday table, even when the cupboard was nearly bare. Even water once became something sweet. Number 10. Wacky cake. A cake pan was mixed right inside itself. Flour, cocoa, and vinegar sat side by side, waiting for hands that knew how to make do. In 1943, in American families during rationing, when eggs, butter, and milk had to be counted carefully, a pan of wacky cake, costing around 18 cents, was still enough to share with the children. She mixed flour with cocoa, made a few small wells with the tip of a spoon, poured in vinegar, stirred quickly, then put the pan into the oven. A quiet reaction made the cake rise. The smell of chocolate spread through the kitchen, warm and deep. The top cracked slightly, while the inside stayed soft and moist under the knife. To children, chocolate cake was still chocolate cake. They remembered the smell of cocoa on their hands, the small square piece of cake, and the card in the recipe box with worn corners. Hard times still knew how to rise softly. Number 9. Dried apple stack cake. Winter in Appalachia was cold and long. In a cloth bag, apple slices dried since summer were soaked until soft again, as if old sunlight had come back. In 1928, in the mountains of Kentucky and Tennessee, apples dried at home cost almost nothing extra. while flour and sugar costing only a few cents could become a cake with many layers. She soaked the dried apples until they softened, cooked them into a thick filling, rolled each cake layer thin, then stacked them carefully. The cake needed to sit overnight so the filling could soak into every layer. The next morning, the knife cut down slowly, and the smell of dark apples, molasses, and baked flour spread across the wooden table. This dish belonged to mountain communities, where neighbors might contribute apples, cake layers, and a little sweetness for a special occasion. Summer apples held winter together. Poor sweets kept a little bit of Sunday. But the old American kitchen also had immigrant stoves, farm kitchens, Cherokee kitchens, and crowded tables full of children without enough chairs. Poor sweets kept a little bit of Sunday, but the old American kitchen also opened into many other voices, from immigrant stoves, farm kitchens, and Cherokee kitchens, to hill country, where the table was full of children and short on chairs. Number 8. Potato pancakes. Grated potatoes fell into the bowl with a wet, heavy sound. When the cakes touched the skillet, the outer edges sang in hot grease, crisp and fragrant. In 1919, in Polish, German, and Jewish immigrant neighborhoods in Chicago and New York, potatoes costing about 3 cents a pound could be stretched into many small cakes. She grated the potatoes with steady hands, squeezed out some of the water through a cloth, mixed them with flour and salt, then pressed them into flat rounds before dropping them into the skillet. Grease bubbled around the edges. The outside turned golden quickly, while the center stayed soft, hot, and carried the familiar potato smell of a crowded kitchen. In immigrant homes, potatoes kept stomachs full and kept the flavor of the old country on an American table. They ate close together, shoulder to shoulder. Cheap potatoes held the smell of the old home. Number 7. Egg drop soup. A small bowl of beaten egg sat beside the pot of broth left from the day before. She poured it in as a thin stream, and yellow ribbons opened in the heat. In 1942, in farm kitchens in Missouri and Iowa, one egg costing about 4 cents could make a leftover pot of broth feel like a softer supper. She heated the broth until the surface of the pot trembled gently, beat the egg in a small bowl, poured it in as a fine thread, then stirred with a very light turn of the wrist. The egg stretched into white and yellow strands, quietly blooming in the liquid. Steam rose with the smell of salt, old bones, and care. One small egg made the whole bowl of soup feel more decent. The sick, the young, and the ones who came home late all received something hot and easy to swallow. One egg softened the evening. Number 6. Bean bread. Cooked beans were mashed into cornmeal in the old bowl. Each little cake firmed in her hands, quiet and enduring. In 1936, in Cherokee families in Oklahoma and North Carolina, dried beans costing a few cents and cheap cornmeal could become boiled cakes wrapped in corn husks. She mashed the beans until smooth, mixed them into the cornmeal, shaped them into firm cakes, then boiled them slowly or wrapped them in corn husks to bake near the fire. The steam carried the warm smell of corn, the soft smell of beans, and the faint sound of the leaves tightening when they met the heat. This dish needs to be spoken of with respect. It held the lasting memory of a community where food carried people through removal, scarcity, and many hard seasons that are difficult to name. Cornmeal and beans held memory. Number 5. Pinto beans and cornbread. The smell of pinto beans simmered for hours, and the cornbread was fresh from the skillet. The kitchen tasted of smoke, hot meal, and the sound of bowls being set on the table. In 1950, in Appalachia and the mining country of West Virginia and Kentucky, pinto beans bought in large sacks and cornmeal costing a few cents could feed a table full of children. She soaked the beans overnight, simmered them with a little fat until soft, mixed the cornmeal, then cooked the cornbread in a cast-iron skillet until the bottom turned crisp. At mealtime, the people in the house broke the bread into their bowls of beans. Corn crumbs fell into the thick bean broth and soaked up the salt and smoke. At a table without enough chairs, this dish stood in as the main meal. Chipped bowls passed from hand to hand. Spoons touched the sides of the bowls, slow and steady. Beans and bread fed the hill country. Immigrant, farm, and hill country dishes showed how 3 cheap ingredients could move through many communities. But the closer the list came to the end, the quieter the food became. Like a last meal before payday, and a memory before sleep. The closer the list came to the end, the quieter the food became. Macaroni, tomatoes, cornbread, cold milk, and one raw onion entered a kitchen already tired after a long day. Number 4. Hoover stew. Soft macaroni bubbled with canned tomatoes. If there were a few slices of hot dog left, they floated up like the last bit of luck. In 1932, in relief kitchens in New York and Chicago, macaroni, canned tomatoes, and cheap hot dogs could be cooked into a pot of stew costing around 15 cents, enough for many bowls. She boiled the macaroni until soft, poured the tomatoes into the pot, sliced the hot dogs thin, then simmered everything until it came together in a warm red. The tomato steam rose with a light sourness. The macaroni swelled, soaking up the sauce, while the cheap meat spread its salty taste through the whole pot. This was a dish of shared crisis, of people standing in line for food, of weeks when a full stomach mattered more than anything beautiful on the table. The red pot carried people through the day. Number 3. Fried green tomatoes. Before the first frost came, green tomatoes were brought into the kitchen. The knife cut down with a firm sound, revealing tart flesh and the smell of a late-season garden. In 1941, in home gardens across the South and the Midwest, green tomatoes were almost free, while a few cents worth of cornmeal and some bacon grease were enough to save a whole basket before the cold took it. She cut the tomatoes into thick slices, coated them in cornmeal, dropped them into hot bacon grease, and then turned each piece when the edges began to crisp. The sizzle was short and bright. The golden crust held the slightly sour center, giving off a smell that was green, smoky, and full of the backyard. In the old kitchen, the season was not over just because the fruit was still green. She brought it to the skillet before the frost could take the last part of the garden. The green fruit still made it to the table. Number 2. Cornbread and buttermilk. On a summer evening, the stove was left alone. She broke cornbread into a tall glass, then poured cold buttermilk over the top. In 1955, in southern Appalachia and the Midwest, cornbread left from the afternoon meal and a few cents worth of buttermilk could become a cool supper after a hot day. She broke the cornbread into large crumbs, sprinkled in a little salt, poured in cold buttermilk, and then let the bread soften in the glass. The spoon touched the glass with a clear, quiet sound. The smell of toasted cornmeal met the gentle tang of the milk, cooling the throat after a day of dust and sun. This dish needed no fire. The people in the house sat near the door, listened to the old fan turning slowly, and ate that simple thing as if it were a way of lulling the evening to sleep. Cold milk soothed the cornbread. Number 1. Cornbread, milk, and onion. Night fell in the Old South. On the table were cornbread, a glass of cold milk, and a raw onion, while the kitchen had almost run out of cooking sounds. In 1950, in the South, Appalachia, and poor regions of America, a few cents worth of cornbread, cheap buttermilk, and one garden onion could become the last meal of the day. She broke the cornbread, poured milk or buttermilk into a glass, sliced the raw onion very thin, and then set everything on the table. The person eating took a bite of onion when they needed its sharpness to cut through the richness of the milk and the dryness of the bread. The smell of onion rose sharply in the dark room, then softened after each cold swallow. This dish stands at the end of the list because it has gone beyond a recipe. It belonged to the quiet table, the worn enamel dishes, and families who understood that fullness sometimes came from something very plain. This was no longer a recipe. 30 dishes have passed through. From morning cornmeal to the raw onion at the end of the day, the old recipe box has nearly closed. 30 dishes have passed through. From morning cornmeal to the raw onion at the end of the day, they came from the working kitchens of America, where farm kitchens, mining country kitchens, immigrant kitchens, southern kitchens, and Appalachian kitchens all held on to a very quiet kind of memory. Some dishes began with cornmeal and water. Some needed beans, salt, pork, and many hours over a low fire. Some softened old bread in hot milk. Some kept the dark pot liquor, the kind that once carried the salt, the fat, and the warmth of the whole pot. 3 ingredients in her hands always carried more than a number. They were the way she remembered prices, stretched the grease in the skillet, held on to the flavor in a bone, and fed one more person without ever needing to say it out loud. The last card was placed back into the wooden box. One corner of the paper still held an old grease stain. The pencil line marking the month and year had faded almost completely. Smoke from the cast-iron skillet rose very lightly, as if supper were still lingering in the house. If one dish on this list reminded you of your grandmother's kitchen, leave the name of that dish below. Maybe she never wrote the whole recipe down because she already knew it by heart.